In this video, we're putting the 12GB 4070 Ti, I have the Asus Tough Edition, up against the new 5070 Ti. I have the Asus Prime model of this, head-to-head in a bunch of tests. And again, 4070 Ti was a 12GB card. If you got it, you might be feeling some of that limitation. 5070 Ti is 16GB, but so far, pricing anywhere near MSRP and availability hasn't been great. But if one does come in stock, what would this upgrade look like if you chose to pursue it? That's what we're exploring in this video, more with graphs and value and current market pricing later. Right now, let's look at performance side by side in a ton of tests. At 4K RT overdrive, so path tracing, using the new transformer model, DLSS performance mode looks pretty good, but our overall frame rates aren't amazing on either GPU, 43 FPS versus 52, giving the new 5070 Ti a 21% advantage. It's certainly more playable, but certainly not amazing. Now, one of the big new features of the 50 series is a ×4 frame generation mode, so let's actually take a look at that. So if they're both in ×2 frame gen mode, the 4070 Ti can output 73 frames to the screen per second, but only half of them are actually responsive to user input. In other words, you can also see the latency numbers up here, and they're getting a little bit high. The 5070 Ti can also use ×2 frame gen mode and output 25% more frames, hitting 91 FPS, and you can see that its latency is a bit lower, potentially a bit more usable. Now, if they're both in their max frame gen modes, that would mean the 5070 Ti could go into a ×4 mode, which doesn't get it any more responsiveness, in fact, a bit less, but it does increase the motion fluidity on the screen. And here we're getting 161 FPS output to the screen, so 121% more than double the frames on the display. But notice that the latency numbers aren't amazing, and this would feel more like 40 FPS with reflex enabled rather than feeling like a true high refresh rate experience. Honestly, I think both GPUs are a little weak for 4K path tracing to be an amazing experience, especially if newer titles implement even heavier versions. What about 1440p though? Well, native path tracing at 1440p is a bit much for both GPUs. The 4070 Ti at 28 FPS and the 5070 Ti is 25% ahead at 35 FPS. But realistically, this isn't the frames you're looking for. So let's skip ahead a bit here and enable DLSS quality with the new transformer model, including the ray reconstruction with the new transformer model on both GPUs. And this looks very good. It's very usable image quality with the upscale, and frame rates are significantly better now. The 4070 Ti is hitting 54 FPS, and the 5070 Ti is hitting 64, which is a 19% improvement. And again, you're going from a little under 60 FPS to a little over 60 FPS. It's definitely a better experience. Neither of these is some amazingly high refresh rate experience. But that does mean we're closer to the frame rates that I would consider a reasonable baseline to use for frame generation to still feel fairly responsive and not have a lot of image quality artifacts. Keep in mind that everybody's preferences for what is the right baseline from which to do frame generation can be different depending on how sensitive you are to latency things or not very sensitive or image quality artifacts, all sorts of things. Anyway, when they're both in the ×2 frame generation mode, the 5070 Ti outputs 16% more frames to the screen at 109 versus 94. And remember that both of those are going to feel about half that responsive. Now, in max frame generation mode at ×2 versus ×4, the 5070 Ti is outputting 197 frames to the display, but is feeling more like 1/4 of that in terms of responsiveness. The 4070 Ti is still at 94, so the 5070 Ti is outputting twice as many frames. And I actually feel like with this baseline, a lot of people will find this experience fine in a single-player title. Another option is to enable balanced mode upscaling, which I didn't used to like using at 1440p if I could avoid it, but with the new transformer model of DLSS, I'm finding it much more usable than I used to. Now, this pushes the 4070 Ti actually up to 65 FPS and the 5070 Ti up to 77, giving the 5070 Ti an 18% advantage in overall frames, and both of them are giving a pretty reasonable experience here for a single-player title. Now, that also means that we have an even higher base frame rate from which to generate frames. So again, this isn't going to make the game feel more responsive, but it will make the motion fluidity smoother on a high refresh rate display. The 4070 Ti now outputting 111 frames to the display, feeling about as responsive as half of that. And the 5070 Ti outputting 128 frames to the display, 15% more total frames to the display. Again, latency numbers are available up above if you want to take a look. In max frame generation mode at ×2 versus ×4, the 5070 Ti is outputting about twice as many frames at 228. Again, it will feel like about 1/4 of that. But if you have like a 240 hertz monitor, this does a better job of taking advantage of the motion fluidity of that high refresh rate display. Not that the 111 frames presented to the display by the 4070 Ti is not also a pretty smooth looking experience. So there you have it. Now, in 1080p at RT Overdrive, no upscaling, we're actually seeing neither GPU is capable of a full 60 FPS. So this just shows how difficult path tracing is, where even these expensive GPUs can't lock in 60 FPS at 1080p. 4070 Ti at 47 FPS and the 5070 Ti at 55, giving it a 17% advantage overall. Now, moving to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 4K Supreme settings, which is not path tracing enabled, but this game does always use ray tracing, and this is native 4K. We notice the 5070 Ti's take a 63% lead at 83 versus 51. What's happening here? The 4070 Ti is out of VRAM. So here we're kicking on DLSS quality, and the 5070 Ti is 46% faster at 114 versus 78. And again, the 4070 Ti is being held back by its VRAM capacity. To be clear though, in this game, if you turn down the texture cache, things will still look fairly similar. In fact, it'll be hard to notice the difference, but it would help rein in the VRAM capacity from a performance standpoint. If we drop down to 1440p, the 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer is just barely enough. At least in this scene, I've seen other scenes in the game struggle at 1440p here. But in this scene with these settings, we do see the 4070 Ti doing okay at 107 FPS and the 5070 Ti 19% faster at 127. Now, another ray tracing test we could look at is Silent Hill 2. At 4K epic settings with hardware RT turned on. This is one of the few Unreal Engine 5 games that allow hardware accelerated lumen on PC. Using DLSS performance, and this game is not updated to DLSS 4 yet, so this is the old CNN model. We're seeing 79 FPS versus 66, 20% advantage for the 5070 Ti. If we turn off hardware RT and still use DLSS performance mode and otherwise maxed out settings, the 5070 Ti is showing 23% faster at 95 versus 77. If we drop down to 1440p maximum settings, so epic settings with hardware RT enabled, the 5070 Ti is at 65 FPS and the 4070 Ti is at 54, giving the 5070 Ti a 20% advantage. It's the difference between a bit below 60 and a bit above 60. Kicking on DLSS quality, keeping everything else maxed out, the 5070 Ti jumps to 91 and the 4070 Ti jumps to 78, giving the 5070 Ti a 17% advantage. At 1440p epic settings with hardware RT turned off and with DLSS quality enabled, we see the 5070 Ti at 109 FPS versus the 4070 Ti at 93, giving the 5070 Ti a 17% advantage over the 4070 Ti. At 1080p epic settings with RT enabled, so maxed out 1080p native resolution, we see the 5070 Ti hitting 89 FPS and the 4070 Ti at 77. 5070 Ti is taking a 16% lead here. At 1080p epic settings with ray tracing turned off, so it's using software-based lumen, we're seeing the 5070 Ti 22% faster at 113 versus 93. In another Unreal Engine 5 showcase, Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, we don't have any hardware RT available in this game, and also high is the name of the highest preset in the game. There's no ultra or epic or anything like that. We see the 5070 Ti hitting 44 FPS, making it 22% faster than the 4070 Ti at 36. So really, these aren't the settings you're going to use. If we go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, the 5070 Ti is at 73 FPS versus 61 on the 4070 Ti, making the new GPU 20% faster. And if we drop to 1440p, by the way, and I should have mentioned this at 4K as well, look at more aliasing going on those little like dangly things and trees in the background on the right side of the screen. My 50 series GPUs, even though these are running the same driver, are showing some weird aliasing effects in this game and this game only, as far as I can tell. So something's wrong with the 50 series in this game. Anyway, 5070 Ti, 74 FPS versus 63, giving it a 17% advantage over the 4070 Ti. 1080p max settings here, we're seeing the 5070 Ti hitting 97 versus 86 on the 4070 Ti, so the new GPU is 13% faster. In God of War Ragnarok at 4K Ultra settings, the 5070 Ti is taking a 30% lead at 73 versus 56, one of the bigger advantages we've seen so far. And if we kick on DLSS quality, the lead drops to 23% at 100 versus 81 FPS, so both of them giving you a pretty high frame rate experience for a single player game that you'd probably be using a controller for. At 1440p Ultra, again, very good frame rates without any upscaling or anything needed. The 5070 Ti at 112 versus 90 on the 4070 Ti, giving the new GPU a 24% advantage. At 1080p Ultra, we see the 5070 Ti at 137 versus 111 on the 4070 Ti. The new GPU is 23% faster. In Final Fantasy XVI at 4K Ultra, neither GPU is probably at the settings you're looking for. We're getting 47 FPS versus 37, which is a 27% advantage for the 5070 Ti. Potentially a little bit of VRAM spillover on the 12GB card here. At 4K Ultra, but with DLSS performance enabled, and I believe this is still the CNN model in this game, no DLSS 4 update at this point. The 5070 Ti is at 93 versus 74 on the 4070 Ti, 26% advantage for the newer card. At 1440p Ultra with no upscaling, the 5070 Ti is at 80 versus 62 on the 4070 Ti, so the new card is 29% faster. And 1440p Ultra DLSS quality enabled puts the 5070 Ti up to 109 and 4070 Ti at 87. So both giving you a nice high refresh rate experience here, 25% faster on the newer card. Final Fantasy XVI at 1080p Ultra, we're seeing the 5070 Ti at 108 versus 87 on the 4070 Ti, putting the new card at 24% faster. In Horizon Forbidden West at 4K very high settings, which is the highest settings available in this game, we see the 5070 Ti hitting 65 with the 4070 Ti at 54. So another one of those games where it's a little over 60 versus a little under 60. 20% advantage for the 5070 Ti. If we kick on DLSS quality, then we see the 5070 Ti jump to 97 FPS versus 76 on the 4070 Ti, putting a 28% advantage in favor of the newer card. If we go to 1440p, we don't need any DLSS or anything to hit high frame rates. The 5070 Ti is at 112 versus 96 on the 4070 Ti, giving the 5070 Ti a 17% advantage. At 1080p max settings, the 5070 Ti is hitting 146 FPS versus 126 on the 4070 Ti, 16% advantage to the 5070 Ti. In Ghost of Tsushima at 4K max settings, which are called very high in this game, we see the 5070 Ti hitting 65, the 4070 Ti hitting 52. So once again, another game where it's kind of a little above, a little below the 60 FPS marker between the two GPUs at 25% advantage for the 5070 Ti. But if you kick on DLSS quality, both GPUs are offering a pretty nice experience here. 5070 Ti at 103 FPS versus 84 on the 4070 Ti, 23% lead for the 5070 Ti. And if we kick on 1440p resolution, I don't think we need any DLSS or anything here. We're seeing 112 versus 94. That's giving a 19% advantage to the 5070 Ti. At 1080p max settings, we see 151 versus 128, so 18% advantage going to the 5070 Ti, and nice high frame rates for everybody. And in Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 4K basic settings, we see 133 versus 117, putting a 14% advantage to the 5070 Ti. Do note that this is the basic settings, not the extreme preset. When I'm testing competitive multiplayer titles, I like to reduce the graphic settings, and this is more in line with how people actually use the game. In competitive titles, people will usually turn down settings for two reasons. One is to boost performance, and the other one is to increase visibility. It's often easier to spot enemies if there's less clutter, foliage, things like that. At 1440p basic settings, we see the 5070 Ti at 224 versus the 4070 Ti at 203. Nice high frame rates for both, 10% advantage to the 5070 Ti, but it is probable that we're starting to see slight system limitations in some cases, kind of compacting the performance lead down for the 5070 Ti, which gets even more the case at 1080p. So at 1080p basic settings, the 5070 Ti is often system limited, and it's hitting 292 FPS average in the built-in benchmark versus 276 on the 4070 Ti, so we're still seeing a 6% lead for the 5070 Ti. But that's being compressed by other system limitations. So this is kind of showing that if you're playing low settings and resolutions in competitive games, getting a newer GPU often just reveals that your GPU wasn't the limit anyway. Now, that's all the tests that I ran. Let's go ahead and pop out with some graphs and some final thoughts. So let's look at this graph first. So this is an overall summary, not of the frames per second in each game. You can go back and look at the footage, and I always timestamp things for any particular game and setting that you wanted to see the frame rates for. What we're looking at here is trying to establish how much faster is the 5070 Ti on average. So if we look at that, what these charts are is in each game, the percentage, the number on the bar is the percent faster of the 5070 Ti when compared to the 4070 Ti. Now, when we look at this and do the geo-mean of all the results, the answer is the 5070 Ti is 22% faster than the 4070 Ti in relative performance. We can see that that's also a fairly typical result, where we have some numbers, some results a bit above 20, some results a bit below 20, but then we do have a couple of outliers in this data set right here. This is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, where the larger performance gap isn't really because the 5070 Ti is more powerful, it's because it has more VRAM. So the 4070 Ti started choking as the system had to reach into system memory, which is slower, to access the game data, and that slowed everything down. So realistically, what it means is you should use lower texture settings in that game in order to reduce the performance lead, and it will really increase the performance of the 4070 Ti. So really, it's just that it can't handle the same settings the 5070 Ti can. And that's caused by that 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer issue. If you want to see this data rearranged rather than being by game, this is now sorted as best result for the 5070 Ti down to the worst result for the 5070 Ti in terms of advantages. We can see that, again, the best results are really where it was a VRAM issue, and the worst results are where we are likely running into some system limitations because we're running at lower settings or resolutions. Notice that 1080p results tend to be overrepresented near the bottom here because you're more likely to be running into other system limitations at those lower resolutions. So another way we can look at this data set to try to establish the differences would be to only look at 4K results, or 4K with a little bit of upscaling, but this is still going to be more GPU limited than the other results. So a Call of Duty at basic settings is still a bit of an outlier as far as being a smaller advantage for the 5070 Ti. It's still a 14% advantage, and the average, the geo-mean of this data set is 26% faster. So now we're seeing the 5070 Ti averaging 26% faster, but once again, we do have these big outliers here that are mostly a VRAM difference rather than a raw power differential. So if you wanted to remove those outliers, we're now seeing that the best result for the 5070 Ti is a 30% advantage in God of War Ragnarok. So this is 4K with the VRAM-related outliers removed, and now we're seeing that the average is the 5070 Ti is 23% faster. So it's looking like the 5070 Ti is a little over 20% faster than the 4070 Ti, but it has more VRAM, which means at certain settings, that difference is exaggerated. And what that really means is the 4070 Ti just can't use certain graphic settings at certain resolutions that the 5070 Ti can. Now, if you're watching this video to try to figure out, is it worth upgrading from a 4070 Ti to a 5070 Ti, I would say, look, if I was choosing which one was better, it's obviously the 5070 Ti. It has more VRAM, has access to multi-frame generation, and it is a little over 20% faster. So obviously I would rather have a 5070 Ti. But that being said, at least if you're watching this video at the time of filming, The pricing on the real market, this listing at $699 is fake. Sometimes you get fake Amazon listings. I did take a look at it. So the real listings are really beginning around $1,000 and up. Sometimes you get some popping in at like $900, but the $750 MSRP seems to be mostly fiction, at least right now around launch. So maybe you're watching in the future, pricing has settled down, and then maybe it would be more reasonable to upgrade. But still, I would say that generally if I'm upgrading GPUs, I'm not going to find a 20% upgrade really worth the hassle and probably hundreds of dollars of cost. Even if you sell the old GPU to help fund the upgrade, you're still probably eating some differential there. 20% isn't massive. I love that you're getting the extra 4 gigabytes of VRAM, and I think that would be nice, but remember, you can just tweak graphic settings to stay within the 12 gigabyte buffer, and you're still gonna be able to enjoy the games, especially if you're at 1440p resolution. So I don't think 20% differential in overall performance really takes one game from playable to from unplayable to playable or anything like that. So I think if you already have the 4070 Ti, I would probably wait another generation and hope that we get like an actual node shrink and maybe pricing's better. We don't know, but that'd be kind of my gut feeling on this. Now, if you're just looking to buy a GPU and you're seeing 4070 Ti's and 5070 Ti's on the market and you're wondering, you know, how much better is one than the other? Well, in that case, you have to factor in what is the price of each one, right? So, for example, we could look at it like this. If the typical 5070 Ti is around $1,000 right now, but it's like 23% faster or so, then if we divide by 1.23, that means that a 4070 Ti at around $800 is offering similar value, if you want to think about it that way. However, the 5070 Ti has some of those intangible benefits that don't show up in the raw performance chart here, where it's more like it has the extra VRAM, it has the multi-frame gen, that type of thing. So if you factor that in, you know, I would say the 5070 Ti is probably worth more than 23% more than a 4070 Ti in terms of how much would I like to have it. Although the 50 series has a couple downgrades, like the lack of 32-bit CUDA support, which loses access to PhysX in the oldest PhysX games. But anyway, anyway, so the point is, like, right now, the GPU market, if you're watching this video at the time of filming, pricing is awful. So I just don't think it's a great time to upgrade. But again, if you're watching this in the future, or if certain deals pop up and you're wondering 4070 Ti versus 5070 Ti, like I said, I think the 5070 Ti is probably worth 25 to 30% more to me than a 4070 Ti would be, due to its increased performance as well as more VRAM and the newer multi-frame gen feature. Kind of cool stuff, but either way, we now see how these GPUs stack up for whatever you want to use that information for. So overall, it doesn't seem like a massive generational improvement, especially when you had the 4070 Ti Super in between that already did about half the performance jump and the 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you already didn't buy the 4070 Ti Super when it came out, then 5070 Ti, I mean, not doing much that we didn't get a year ago with the 4070 Ti Super, and I have a separate head-to-head video with the 4070 Ti Super versus the 5070 Ti. Feel free to take a look at that one. Hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.